Good afternoon, and welcome to UCF Coastal's Lunch on the Coast Speaker Series. I'm Dr. Graham Worthy, Director of UCF Coastal. Through this speaker series, I hope you gain appreciation for the extent of basic and applied coastal research underway here at UCF. Orlando may be an inland city, but we still contribute to the issues facing our coast, and are in turn impacted by those same issues. One of the goals of UCF Coastal is to grow public awareness about the amazing coastal resources we frequently take for granted. To achieve that goal, we've assembled an incredible team of cutting-edge researchers who serve as a resource for everyone from marine scientists to the general public, businesses, and policymakers. Our Lunch on the Coast speaker series is running from July through December, with one speaker each month. Through this series, we're proud to highlight some of the recent research undertaken by the diverse interdisciplinary faculty of UCF Coastal. You'll learn what it really means to live in a coastal state, with expert perspectives ranging from archaeology to coastal planning, from engineering and economics to ecosystem and human health. You'll get an appreciation for the full range of issues currently facing our coasts and the resources that UCF Coastal is bringing to bear to help foster an understanding of those threats and hopefully chart a path forward. Now let me pass you over to our moderator, who will be introducing you to this month's speaker, and we'll also be running our question and answer session following the talk. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope you enjoy the Lunch on the Coast speaker series.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Emmerich. I'm an associate professor of environmental science and public administration here at UCF in the School of Public Administration and the director of research for UCF Coastal. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce a colleague and friend as your speaker for today's Lunch on the Coast speaker series, Dr. Claire Knox. Dr. Knox is an associate professor also in the School of Public Administration and also a founding member of UCF Coastal. Dr. Knox is also a part of UCF's Emergency and Crisis Management Program, and I would be remiss if I did not mention that it was under her leadership that this program has gained a #2 ranking in the United States in terms of emergency management programs. Dr. Knox is a critical theorist who is more recently focusing on cultural competency and has always been interested in planning issues, specifically and especially community planning and state planning. Dr. Knox will talk to us today about compound disasters and how communities might better approach planning from a resiliency perspective. And I introduce to you Dr. Knox.
So I'm originally from coastal Louisiana, a little town called Lafayette, and our whole coastline, we lose a football field every 45 minutes. And so to understand the connection between our coastal wetlands as our first line of defense against storms resonated with me even as a child. I'm Claire Connolly Knox, and I study how communities can become more resilient post-disaster. And that's what I love about studying plans and policies post-disaster, is it gives us a window of opportunity to make some changes and to bring in those best practices and those lessons learned. So for example, we received here in Central Florida a number of individuals from Puerto Rico following Hurricane Maria. And we saw very quickly, especially in Osceola County, that the schools, the roads, the hospitals, etc., got inundated with an extra population. We're going to be seeing that on a more frequent basis, and it's not just here in Central Florida. We're looking around the United States, around the world. So in emergency management, one of the challenges that we constantly are facing is how do we link the theoretical with the practical? As a former practitioner, I'm always keeping that on my forefront, whether that's in my research and frustrating my theoretical co-authors and going, how does this apply? Yes, this is great theoretically, but what does this look like to an emergency manager or planner or public administrator on the ground?
So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Claire Knox. Dr. Knox, take it away.
Thank you so much, Chris, for that warm introduction, and a special thanks to UCF Coastal for the opportunity to present some of my research here today with you. I love studying post-disaster plans, policies, reports, and as a profession, we're constantly learning from those past disasters to improve all phases of emergency management, including preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation. And while it's easy to document the lessons learned, it's harder to implement those lessons. It's not so straightforward. There are political, financial, and organizational challenges. So this in part drives my passion for analyzing plans and policies post-disaster to help find those disconnects to help our coastal communities become more resilient. And so we want to avoid this, right? This is the 2016 Louisiana flood. Local land use plans were using outdated flood maps from 1996. 80% of the victims did not have flood insurance, and many of them were survivors from Hurricanes Katrina and Rita in 2005, who relocated to the Baton Rouge area. So this was primarily new development. Flooding is our most common and costly natural disaster in the United States. However, communities around the U.S. are not adequately updating their plans to include flooding because of political and economic reasons. For example, it might lower my property value, or it will prevent us from increasing our business opportunities. Yet we know that for every dollar we spend on flood mitigation, there's a $6 return on investment back to our economy. And Louisiana is not alone. Here is Texas during Hurricane Harvey in 2017. Including hazard-related elements into a comprehensive land use plan is critical for our resiliency. Why? One reason is that hazard plans do not have legal standing. Comprehensive land use plans do. As seen in the 2016 Louisiana floods, and again here with Hurricane Harvey, allowing development in flood-prone areas, especially floodplains, increases residents' vulnerability. So these examples are of single disasters with cascading impacts. What happens when there are compounding disasters with cascading impacts on the menu? Hence the name of today's presentation. And so we get the Lawrence Welk effect, right? And a 1 and a 2 and a 3. And we see that disasters are complex and dynamic events that test leaders and public administrators at all levels of government. When disasters compound, which means 2 or more occurring simultaneously, then resources become taxed, and the preparedness, response, and recovery phases often overlap. Therefore, leaders must make very difficult decisions about prioritizing needed resources and services. Thus, when responding to and managing compounding disasters, it is difficult and it requires a multi-hazard, multi-sector, whole community approach. Compounding disasters require coordination and collaboration among multiple government agencies, levels of government, and sectors, while multiple phases are still overlapping. This means traditional emergency management plans are often insufficient during compounding disasters. Socially vulnerable populations are also at a greater risk of the impacts from disasters because they have greater exposure to hazards, fewer resources to prepare for and to recover from these disasters, and they face greater economic, physical, political, and socially cultural obstacles. So due to the prolonged nature of COVID-19, compounding disasters were inevitable as disasters continued to occur. The next slide shows $22 billion disasters occurring in the United States during 2020, and it was primarily impacting the Southeast region. While FEMA and other government officials focused on COVID-19 throughout 2020, other disasters occurred, including hurricanes, wildfires, earthquakes, tornadoes, floods, and significant civil unrest and protests. In fact, looking at this map is a little deceiving. These are only the $22 billion disasters, which broke a record, but there were still other disasters that are not captured that were happening. So with these $22 billion weather and climate related disasters, it cost approximately $95 billion and resulted in 262 deaths. And we're seeing this trend increasing. Between 1980 and 2020, the US averaged $7.1 billion disasters annually. However, if we look just between 2016 and 2020, the average more than doubled to 16.2 disasters annually. So remember that before we entered 2020, many of our communities here in Florida were still recovering from previous disasters, most notably Hurricane Irma in 2017. This disaster once again tested Florida's emergency management system, especially new policy and organizational changes from the 2004 hurricane season. It was the 7th named storm of the 2017 hurricane season and made landfall on September 10th. Most notable was the size of the storm, which spanned the entire state of Florida. The unpredictable path led to a record evacuation of 6.5 million people. Those remaining filled 700 shelters and housed approximately 200,000 people. The destruction was primarily experienced in Central and South Florida, with over 6.7 million people without power for a few days up to a few weeks. And the agriculture industry itself experienced an estimated $2.5 billion in losses. And so we can see from this list some of the cascading impacts felt during Hurricane Irma. And in our analysis of the Hurricane Irma after action reports, we derived multiple themes. We saw experience with economic loss to property and businesses, infrastructure loss, having those evacuations and sheltering, especially for special needs shelters, having issues with food and nutrition gaps, being a receiving community on top of this for the Hurricane Maria evacuees. And then we're continuing to see issues with nursing homes and extended care facilities. And of course, it raised our awareness of the increased vulnerabilities due to climate change. So one of the major themes that we were able to pull out of these after action reports also included fiscal issues, and it was identified in all of the after action reports. Then shortly thereafter, in 2018, the Pew Foundation came out with a study that analyzed the state levels of state government funding of natural disasters. They concluded that most states do not comprehensively track natural disaster spending, and that state spending is highly variable. So this led my colleague, Dr. David Mitchell, and I to survey local government officials here in Central Florida, including city and county level emergency managers, municipal managers, and officials in other local government agencies. And we asked them questions focused on disaster funding and budget related issues within their organization in recent disasters. And two major themes arose. First, that there are policies and procedures that are hindering and challenging their ability to be able to respond fiscally. So we see here that FEMA's policies and procedures for reimbursements are inconsistent, ever-changing, and extremely vague. The state's process is highly redundant. They had an issue regarding stacked reimbursements where the next disaster was already striking, but they hadn't been reimbursed for the previous disaster. And it should be noted that these local governments have to front the money for response and preparedness of one disaster, and then eventually they get reimbursed. FEMA tries to do it within 2 years, but the reality is that it often takes longer. And so when Hurricane Irma impacted Florida, many local governments were still waiting on reimbursements from Hurricane Matthew the prior year. Then Hurricane Michael hit in 2018. And so it should be noted that during those 3 years, all 67 Florida counties were under at least one disaster declaration. This means that those Florida counties put out money to respond to those disasters, and then other storms were coming right behind them. And then with the delayed reimbursements, other city operations have to be modified because there's only so much money at the end of the day. So that was one of the themes. The other theme dealt with organizational capacity. So this really spoke to a lot of those smaller rural communities that it only takes one disaster for them to be into financial ruin. There's an inability to track disaster response expenditures that are required for full FEMA reimbursement. So you have to document everything, your staff's time and hours to be reimbursed. And if you don't have the staffing and the capacity to be able to capture that data, you're not going to get reimbursed. And finally, their organization can often suffer from disaster amnesia when there's a long period of time between disasters, which we saw during Hurricane Irma. So scholars and government officials have noted that delayed reimbursements hinder government's ability, especially at the local government level, their ability to recover quickly and in a resilient way. Delayed reimbursements directly impacts a community's ability to increase their resiliency. So as I mentioned, by the time 2020 came around, specifically February of 2020, when COVID-19 really started impacting the US, the level of disaster resiliency across the nation varied greatly, especially among local governments, and especially for communities here in Florida who were recovering from 3 back-to-back disasters or hurricanes. And so we have 2020. President Trump declared COVID-19 a national emergency under the Stafford Act on March 13th, and the federal government began issuing recommendations to state and local officials. It should be noted, this is the first time in modern history that every emergency operations center in the United States was activated. First time every emergency manager was working on the same crisis. And it's the first time that all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and 5 territories were approved for a major disaster declaration. Also, FEMA was working with 22 tribes under this disaster declaration. As we know, COVID-19 is a continuing, ongoing emergency where almost 226 million people around the world have been infected, with 4.6 million deaths. In the US, we're seeing over 42 million people infected, with nearly 680,000 deaths. So COVID-19 presented a unique event that tested governments and communities. Not since the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 have we witnessed a health crisis of such proportion. In fact, many state and local pandemic plans were based on that previous crisis. They were insufficient to deal with the magnitude of the COVID-19 pandemic. Additionally, there are and continue to be tensions between state and local governments, especially when each are controlled by different parties and different priorities. This can also lead to compounding disasters. The pandemic and ensuing response efforts have disproportionately impacted minority and socially vulnerable populations, which has surfaced some social inequity issues. For example, in our study on food insecurity, we noticed that food issues were a problem with all of our survey respondents. However, these issues were more pronounced among households at high risk for COVID-19, essential workers, and minorities. These 3 groups reported instances of not being able to obtain regular meals through their community programs, food through school food programs, or food through their food pantry or soup kitchen at much higher rates than the entire sample. However, we know that the pandemic wasn't the only disaster or crisis that our nation was facing. We were also facing the busiest hurricane season that broke many records. We were experiencing civil protests due to police officer involved shootings, and this photo was outside the Orlando Police Department. we were experiencing wildfires, and especially in the West in California. And then finally, we had a highly contested presidential election. So as 2021 approached, there was little hope of reducing the frequency of disasters with the insurrection on the US Capitol on January 6th, Surfside, Florida building collapse on June 24th, heat waves and wildfires in the Pacific Northwest in July, and Hurricane Ida on August 29th, the 16th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. The increased frequency of compounding disasters demonstrates the need for additional research. Now, while there's multiple examples to choose from, and I'm lucky to be part of a number of teams that are studying this from multiple angles, I'm going to focus on one recent study of the compounding effects on disasters. So in this research, I focused in on my hometown of Lafayette, Louisiana. It's located just off of I-10 in southern Louisiana between Houston, Texas, and New Orleans. In 2020, local government officials were managing 4 compounding disasters. First, there was the COVID-19 pandemic, in which New Orleans was a hotspot in March of 2020, as officials believed Mardi Gras festivities in late February was a super spreader event. Second, there was a 58% increase in the homeless population, including a 193% increase in family homelessness in Lafayette due to the pandemic, which placed an additional strain on an overburdened system. Third, there were protests following a police officer-involved shooting on the evening of August the 21st, which led to citywide protests that continued for days. Fourth, and not least, Hurricane Laura made landfall 6 days later in southeastern Louisiana on August 27th as a Category 4 hurricane. It was the strongest storm to make landfall in the state during a busy 2020 hurricane season. It was the third of 5 storms that made landfall in Louisiana that season. Again, another record. And it was the most expensive weather disaster in 2020. So if you were the mayor and you were expected to shelter hurricane evacuees in your town from surrounding coastal communities, what would you do? Considering you have 4 compounding disasters impacting your city, what would you do? This is a question we're going to be having to answer more often. The compounding disasters of a pandemic, increased homeless population, civil unrest, and a Category 4 hurricane resulted in Mayor President Guillory's decision not to open any short-term mass care shelters as a receiving community and banned churches from opening shelters. While this information was shared via a text message between the mayor's office and some officials, it was shared eventually through the media, and there was huge backlash that resulted, including national media attention. So while leadership stressed that there were bad actors who were from out of town, as we're seeing in other major US cities that were experiencing civil protests, all of those who were arrested here in Lafayette were from Lafayette or the neighboring towns. So as I mentioned earlier, when disasters compound, resources become taxed, and the preparedness, response, and recovery phases often overlap. Therefore, leaders must make difficult decisions about prioritizing needed resources and services. So think back for a moment to my video in which we in Central Florida were a welcoming and receiving community for Hurricane Maria evacuees. What is that going to look like in the future if we can't accept them because we as a community are already stressed and overburdened? What is that going to look like? With climate change, we are constantly seeing that there is going to be forced migration. How do we plan for that? This case study is not unique to Lafayette. These are hard decisions that are being repeated around the United States and will continue to have these conflicting issues as compounding disasters become more and more common. We will be needing to update our plans to capture these dynamics. So are these natural disasters? As we have seen, a lot of this goes back to how do we plan our communities. While this is an ongoing discussion, we know that climate change is a game changer. 2020 and the compounding disasters it brought made us very aware of this. After analyzing comprehensive land use plans in coastal Louisiana and Florida, and now a NOAA grant to analyze plans in Texas post-Harvey, we know that climate change is not being reflected in many of these land use and emergency management plans and policies. For example, we need to update evacuation plans and the timing of these warnings as hurricanes increase in intensity and speed, as we saw in Hurricane Ida. Most importantly, we need to stop incentivizing development in hazardous areas. This practice increases the vulnerability of our communities. Research shows that communities that incorporate hazard mitigation elements into their land use plans experience less damage from a disaster, and they recover more quickly. Urban planners and emergency managers need to be at the same table. Compounding disasters highlight the need to increase local government's capacity to respond to and recover from these disasters. Remain flexible with existing plans and policies that many of them need to be rewritten. And it highlights the need to strengthen collaborations among various stakeholders. These recommendations are not necessarily new. However, local governments continue to struggle with adopting and implementing best practices and lessons learned from previous disasters. If 2020 taught us nothing else, disasters will continue to impact our populations unequally. Plans must more adequately account for vulnerabilities. Failure to do so will continue to result in negative impact to lives. Federal agencies are required to include these populations in their emergency management preparedness, response, and recovery plans. It is not required at the state and local government levels. So we need to ask ourselves, who is at the table? How are socially vulnerable populations being discussed and included in your plans and policies? Do not assume that they are. The fiscal strain posed by disasters, especially compounding disasters, test a community's resiliency. If increasing a community's resiliency to disasters is based in part on fiscal sustainability, then the current federalist system of post-disaster reimbursement may be fatal to these efforts. Finally, no plan is perfect. However, the planning process is an essential element for a disaster resilient community. Each disaster provides opportunities to learn and improve, make institutional changes, modify existing plans and policies, strengthen collaborations, especially with faith-based and private organizations, and to educate the public. Yet, many local governments lack the capacity to implement these changes and execute these plans. As a nation, we will continue to see an increase in the frequency and intensity of weather-related and human-induced disasters. The resiliency and capacity of these communities will continue to be tested. Thank you again for your time and the opportunity to share my research, and I am open to any questions or comments that you have.
Let me start by saying thank you, Claire, for this very informative lunch on the coast presentation. It has spawned a lot of discussion already. Don't worry, Claire, about looking at the Q&A. We will feed you questions. We will fill you up by the end of this lunch on the coast with questions. We have a few questions already coming in, but those that have other questions, please drop them in the Q&A below, and we will attempt to get to them with the time we have left. Claire, the several questions have aligned themselves so far along three topical areas. One is disaster history, one's about reimbursement, and one is about managed retreat and how some federal government programs might be causing additional burden. So we'll start with the early ones, disaster history. There was a clarifying question that folks had about, is it the number of billion-dollar disasters or the amount of money, meaning which value doubled? The average number of disasters, did that double to 16, or did the cost double to 16 billion? Which one?
Oh, thank you for allowing me the chance to expand upon that. It's the number of disasters. So it went from 7.1 annually to an average of 16.2 annually. So the number is increasing. Right,
and I think it's important to note here that, and I had put this in the answer to the question, that these are only the billion-dollar disasters. Many, many, many other disasters cause less than $1 billion are not even in this metric from NOAA. So this is, by all accounts, a conservative estimate of the amount that disasters are impacting our communities. So
absolutely.
Thank you. Reimbursement question. Sorry, the first questions came from Rebecca D. and Bobby Mladenov. The second set of questions on reimbursement come from Jennifer Shockley, who asks, what exactly is delaying these reimbursements?
Oh, so great question. There's a number of reasons. And so we're looking at issues of a lot of personnel turnover, not only within FEMA and also at the state level. So when these reimbursements are submitted at the local government level, it makes its way up to the state and the federal. And there's a lot of turnover. There's a lot of delay. Other examples that our respondents provided is the fact that they'll complete one form, and then by the time they submit it, the form's been changed. And so now they're having to redo the form. Part of it is that the amount of data that is required from the local governments to complete the forms properly, a lot of times isn't captured in real time. And so it takes time to go back and get those numbers. And the list goes on and on. So unfortunately, it's a multifaceted issue that I wish there was one simple answer that could fix it, but it is something that local governments, and again, this is city managers, county managers, emergency managers, are really struggling with, because they're putting forth hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars for preparedness and response efforts to keep their community safe, and then they're not getting that money back.
At all, or in a timely manner? In
a timely manner.
Okay.
Thank you. And honestly, even one of the respondents said that, at some point, depending on the amount that's being asked to be reimbursed, is it even worth the time? The staffer's time to complete the paperwork, to submit it, to then wait a year or two to get some, if not all, the money back. And so, we have some smaller communities who they're at the point of having to decide, because the next disaster is coming. So do I spend my limited staffing time to complete all this paperwork that may come back, that may get pushed back, or get them those staff members to prepare my community for the next disaster that's coming? And these are some really hard decisions that our local communities are facing.
All right, thank you. Okay, same line of questioning about reimbursements. Based on your experience and knowledge, this is from Rebecca D. Do you believe Florida and other states can economically afford a different method for reimbursement so that it doesn't stack so much? Is there a better way? What is the better way?
Well, it wouldn't just be limited to Florida. So with FEMA, it's a nationwide reimbursement system, and so what Pew Foundation study has alluded to is the fact that there's so much that the system needs to be redone, and then down to the state level, there's so much variability in how it's being processed that it's almost every state needs to be looking at how they do their reimbursement program. So So it's not just Florida, is I guess the small answer, is that it is a systematic issue that needs to be addressed at FEMA's level and then also at the state level across all states.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to another line of questions. This has gotten quite this idea of mitigation, managed retreat. How do we deal with this? There's several questions, so I'm going to try to align them. Number one is kind of a simple one at the first cut, but maybe not simple to answer. How often are local communities updating flood zones and disaster plans?
That's a really great question. Actually, probably Chris, you're probably well in line to be able to answer this as well. So it varies. There are requirements for emergency management plans to be updated, and Florida is unique in the fact that Florida, pretty much I think almost every county has been accredited. So the Florida counties have gone through the process of having accredited emergency management programs, which includes their plans. And so that is done on I think it's a 5-year basis that it is updated. We're lucky here in Florida for that. However, in other states, that requirement is not there. In fact, in other states like Louisiana, it's not even required for parishes. We have parishes back there, for parishes to have a comprehensive land use plan. They don't even have to have a plan. And so what we're finding is a huge discrepancy across the United States. So ideally, plans should be updated, as land use plans should be updated on a regular basis. Some jurisdictions have restrictions on telling them how to do that. That being said, even in my analysis of more recent plans where you would think they would have these best practices incorporated, things like climate change, I'm finding that a number of more recent plans don't even include elements of climate change in their comprehensive land use plan. And so I say that in the fact that it's more than just having an updated plan, is that we need to be really digging into these plans to make sure that they're implementing these lessons learned. So a lot of times they're not.
All right. Paul Skinner asks, hey Paul, can you tell us about any, and I'm paraphrasing, can you tell us about any systematic efforts underway at FEMA to stop rebuilding homes and businesses in repeated flood areas? He says, we are not in a flood zone, but we bought an annual NFIP insurance for years to help out with the pool of money available. But rates keep going up, and FEMA seems to make little or no effort to redline some of these areas for rebuilding. So hence we dropped our coverage.
And you're not alone. There's multiple people who are facing this issue. So what I will say is that there have been calls for FEMA to redo a number of their programs, this being one of them, for that reason. In a lot of ways, having the National Flood Insurance Program is almost incentivizing people to stay in hazardous prone areas or to continue to build in hazardous prone areas. It's supplementing these not great activities, right? And so again, this is one of many programs in FEMA that need to be readdressed. There were some issues that came around after Hurricane Katrina, for example, when people were trying to get reimbursed on an individual level for their home and to be able to rebuild. Well, a lot of the documentation that was required for FEMA didn't necessarily apply to Louisiana. In Louisiana, we passed down our homes, and so the property documentation might not have the current owner's name. It may have someone else's, or that information was lost because there was major devastation in Hurricane Katrina. And so that delayed reimbursement for people in Louisiana to rebuild. And so again, FEMA's constantly learning, but there have been a number of calls that some of these programs are actually incentivizing opposite what we should be doing.
Unfortunate. I'm switching some questions around, Claire. The questions are pouring in. So along these lines, because we're talking about people either having greater flood risk because of development, or someone indicated that I'm sorry that I missed the name here. They had the opportunity to speak with someone at the City of Orlando's emergency operations. We mentioned the I-4 project and how the I-4 project has changed a lot of the topography in Orlando and made some zones that weren't previously at flood risk, effectively have a higher flood risk. Do you know anything about this and how to better study how infrastructure projects might be influencing worsening flooding in other places?
I don't know about that specific case study, and kudos to you for going and learning more about what's happening and talking to Director Soto at the Orange County, City of Orlando's Emergency Operations Center. But what we're seeing is that this is consistently happening over time in all of our communities. We're finding that changes in land use have huge impacts to flooding in other areas, and this is part of why the impact to the 2016 Louisiana flood and Hurricane Harvey was so detrimental, was that a lot of this was just changes in the land use plans that weren't aligning with the hazards mitigation plans that weren't being updated with the flood maps. And so this huge disconnect led to this disaster. And it goes back to, are we having natural disasters, or is part of this actually influenced by humans? And so that's a bigger conversation to have. So as a homeowner, and I know there's a number of homeowners here in the presentation, is to constantly be aware of that, realize that land use changes that are happening around you could impact your flood zone, that if you weren't in a flood zone, you might be now. So it's definitely something to stay on top of.
And as the godfather of hazards or flood research put, Gilbert White, floods are largely an act of God. Flood losses are largely an act of man. So I think we're trying to dig ourselves out of this U.S. Army Corps ideology of techno fixes, and in the process, we're going to end up doing more damage maybe in the short run. But it's a slippery slope. So on to even a bigger slippery slope. And Dr. Knox, I'm not sure you are aware of this recent NPR investigation, but Maria Cortez tells us that she's heard recently about an NPR investigation that HUD is actually buying homes in flood-prone areas and then selling them back to other people that are unsuspecting. And it's frustrating. Someone else put it's frustrating as a resident to see headlines such as "The federal government sells flood-prone homes to often unsuspecting buyers," NPR finds. Have you studied, or are you aware of better practices so that we don't repeat mistakes described like this, like that in this headline?
Well, thank you for bringing that to our attention. I did hear a bit of that story that was covered. I think it was out of Tampa, if I'm not mistaken. And I was like you, I was alarmed. I had not heard about HUD doing that. Specifically, I know HUD is responsible for buying out properties in coastal Louisiana. In Ile de Jean Charles, that Native American tribe, they are the first climate change refugees, although they're not excited about the name refugees. But we do see where HUD has taken on a lot of the responsibilities for buying out homes in some of these flood-prone areas. But I had not heard about them flipping them. And again, there are, I think, if there's some silver lining happening in 2020 with these disasters, is that we're seeing the social inequity issues that are arising, and how much of it is systemic, and how many of these programs need to be looked at again for these different issues. So thank you for bringing that to our attention, and I'll definitely be digging more into it afterwards.
All right, thank you, Dr. Knox. So we're switching from the doom and gloom to more silver lining, right?
Okay.
Several questions around what lessons should be transferred from local communities to higher education settings. What steps could university administrators consider as they weigh the impact of these multiple disasters on their campuses? What best, and you can answer any, all, or none of these, right? What best practices have you seen in working with low-income communities after flood or hurricane related disasters? So what lessons are learned? How can we take these lessons learned and apply them?
Wow, this is such a great question. Thank you for it. First of all, a university, especially one the size of UCF, is a true community partner. And so part of that is to live up to that mantra of being a community partner. And so part of it is the research that myself and colleagues are doing here in UCF Coastal, as well as the School of Public Administration, community-based research. So working with some of these organizations to update their plans and to assist residents with any of the bureaucracy that surrounds a lot of these issues. And we are. I'm super proud to be part of UCF Coastal and our resiliency team, and to be able to have that community-based research. And then of course educating the future emergency managers. Having our programs here at UCF, we're able to bring this research into our classrooms and to help to prepare the next generation of emergency managers to be more aware of these issues and to think about it strategically, to be critical. If I understand the final question correctly, especially with some of these more socially vulnerable populations, and working with them is to listen to them. I think that's probably the most important thing that we can do, is to listen to them. To come in as an academic and think that we know it all, we don't. These people are living it, they're breathing it, and to do anything otherwise is really harmful. So that's always what I go into any community with. And again, a lot of it stems from my volunteer experience on some environmental justice issues in Cancer Alley in Louisiana, and working with some underserved populations, is to listen. So I can elaborate more, but I'll stop there.
Well, don't worry about that, because there's more time and more questions to elaborate on. Dr. Knox, this question may just be for the purposes of having discussion. I'm not certain that you'll be able to answer this. Given that forced migration or managed retreat due to climate change will likely occur in the long term, should monetary resources be allocated to such vulnerable areas, or should the focus shift to areas that are more resistant to these disaster event types? So perhaps this is just a question for the larger group to think about and consider, but I'll pitch it to you here.
Yeah, so this is one question that I continue to challenge myself with, because this is a question that every community is going to have to face. And this was part of a conversation that we started having post Hurricane Katrina. Should we rebuild New Orleans or parts of New Orleans, right? And that's a Pandora's box that I don't think our nation is ready to open yet. We do see some concerted efforts to do buyouts of neighborhoods, to relocate people, but it's very piecemeal. And so I think if we're going to really address this systematically, I don't know if we're there yet. And I'm not sure what's going to take. I keep saying the next big one. But 2020 happened, and we're still having this conversation. But at some point, local governments, especially if they're maintaining roads that are in coastal areas that continue to get washed out, that infrastructure that continue to be impacted. At what point do we say enough? At what point do we say, we can't afford this anymore? I don't know. If I knew the answer to that, I'd write a book and make a whole lot of money. But it's hard. It's not easy. It's so hard.
Okay. Yes, I agree. When is enough enough? Knowing more and losing even more is where we're at right now. Okay, so we're moving beyond the silver lining to what the future holds. And
was that the silver lining? Oh no.
Yeah, well, trying to make the best out of bad situation. The first question you can answer, I can also answer, is there a way to measure community resilience? How can we know which community is more resilient than others objectively? And so I will give you a short break, Dr. Knox. There are several articles I've written on community resilience. Dr. Cutter at the University of South Carolina, wow, has downscaled the Community Resilience Index to the sub-county level. So there is a way, but I would reframe that question and say, is there a way to know how our community is more resilient or less resilient than it was previously, rather than comparing one community to another, although I presume counties or states or others want to do this comparison. But we like to take it down to the community level and say, how can we help you become more resilient? Moving on from that, 3 questions about where we go from here. First one, this is wonderful. Are workshops or webinars with local governments and community institutions something you or other faculty have considered to spread your research? There's a follow-on to this question, basically the same question from someone else. How does UCF Coastal work with other state and nationwide researchers and local communities on emergency preparedness? And finally, and you can wrap all these up together, as a community member not involved in emergency management, is there anything I can do to advocate for better land use requirements in my city to mitigate these risks?
Wow, these are oh gosh, these are great questions. So yes, we do workshops and webinars. I have been, and we're always welcome to it. So if you in your local community would like any of us to come and talk to your county commissioners, to public, whatever, please let us know. I've had the opportunity to get small contracts through the East Central Florida Regional Planning Council to help analyze land use and emergency management plans for some of our coastal counties and present that to a number of officials. And I'm trying to be Debbie Downer, but what I was saying, and I talked to the planning folks afterwards, I'm like, you know, what I'm finding and what I'm presenting shouldn't be groundbreaking. And they said, no, we've been trying to say this for years, but having you come in, the county commissioners are more likely to listen to you than to us. So if that is something that, you know, research-backed recommendations can help your community become more resilient, please let us know. And then what was the last question, Chris?
How can I do to get involved or advocate for better land use requirements in my city to mitigate these risks?
Yeah, so one big component is to call your local urban and regional planning office. Again, they have public hearings anytime they do any changes to their land use plans. Get involved, get active, but ask questions like, is your emergency manager involved in the process? Are you linking your hazard mitigation plans with your land use plans? Are your flood maps updated? Who's at the table? Again, making sure all voices are heard is critical in the planning process.
Awesome. We have one late entry, and I'll leave it as, well, maybe we still have a little more time. The military, especially the Navy, recognizes the coastal problem and has taken steps to mitigate future problems caused by sea level rise. How do you think they're doing?
So there's a really great book that I would recommend called The Greening of the Military. And it's not just on climate change related issues, but it's how the military has really embraced conservation and of lands, and it's really beneficial for them. So one example is in the panhandle of Florida. You have Eglin Air Force Base, and they have a really great partnership with the Nature Conservancy to do a greenway project that allows there to be a natural conservation buffer around the not only the Air Force Base, but also their flight pattern that allows for wildlife to flourish. But we're seeing specifically climate change impacting in North Carolina, I'm blanking, Norfolk, Virginia, they're having huge flooding issues with climate change and sea level rise, and to the point that they can't even access their base if there's a rain event. So they're really rethinking how are we going to redo our infrastructure to make sure that we can stay here as long as we can. But at some point, that huge infrastructure is going to have to move. Oh, and one last thing to relate to that, with especially with Department of Homeland Security, they have plans on climate change. They have plans on, because they know climate change is going to impact forced migration of individuals from other countries into the US. So for decades, they've had plans to prepare for this. So a lot of, for a while there, people were like, climate change isn't being dealt with at the federal government. It was, but it wasn't being heavily publicized. And the Department of Homeland Security is one example of that.
Great. Well, Claire, there is one last question that I will endeavor to answer, and you can correct me. And that, again, someone asked again, how does UCF Coastal work with other states and nationwide researchers and local communities on emergency management? And I will be the first to tell you that we have Dr. Christy Lewis, who is on the ground working with Mote Marine Laboratory and Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute to try to help solve the red tide issue. So that's a real local issue that she's trying to solve. I myself, I'm a hazards geographer. I've done a lot with the state of Florida, with Puerto Rico, state of South Carolina on after disasters happen, doing the impact and unmet needs assessment. So I'm a geographer. I like to compare places and really dig into the numbers. Of course, you've heard from Dr. Knox, who does a lot of analysis of plans and trying to move plans into alignment with each other. Again, I can't iterate enough how emergency management really needs to be tied into all planning at state and local levels. Dr. Thomas Wall in our research group does compound and cascading disasters, specifically the interaction of rainfall with storm surge. You don't need a 100-year flood event and a 100-year storm surge event to cause 1,000-year impacts. We saw that in Jacksonville. So Dr. Wall's an engineer that's doing that sort of stuff. Sergio Alvarez in our group is an economist looking at a variety of different things related to hazards and disasters, specifically in the leisure and tourist industry and in agriculture industries. And we have political scientists like Jacopo Baggio, who are taking, along with Dr. Knox, a deep look at a lot of these plans to try to see where they're aligning and where they're not aligning. So if you have a coastal problem, who are you going to call? UCF Coastal. So Claire, I don't know if you have anything to add to that. But
I can't top that. That's brilliant.
That's right. So we'd like to thank you again, Claire, for coming out with us today. And we'd like to thank everyone for showing up. We'd like to invite you to meet us for the next UCF Coastal event, which you will see flash up on the screen here, October 12th, Kelly Kibler, and What's a Beach Picnic Without Sand? Thanks again, Claire. Thanks everyone for coming, and we'll see you on October 12th.